Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Leave a comment below about where you are watching from, because today we are delving into the dark depths of 1915 Missouri, where the disappearance of a young teacher turned a quiet community into the stage for a mystery that echoes to this day. The year 1915 marked a period of transformation in the United States. The nation was still experiencing the effects of industrialization. But in rural Missouri, particularly in the Ozark Mountains, life moved to a different rhythm. It was a time when dirt roads cut through wild landscapes, where small communities knew each other by name, and where secrets, once buried, remained so for decades. The Ozarks have always possessed a peculiar atmosphere. Their rolling hills, covered with dense oak and walnut forests, created isolated valleys where entire settlements could exist almost invisible to the outside world. The rugged terrain and poor roads meant that some localities were completely cut off during the harsh Missouri winters. It was in this setting that small towns like Cedar Hollow thrived in their own world, away from the prying eyes of major metropolises. Cedar Hollow in Webster County was one such community. With just over 300 inhabitants, the town spread out along a single main street, flanked by a Methodist church, a general store, a white-painted wooden schoolhouse, and a few modest residences. The local economy relied primarily on subsistence farming and logging from the surrounding woodlands. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where doors were seldom locked, and where the arrival of a stranger was a topic of conversation for weeks. It was in this seemingly tranquil environment that Abigail Renshaw arrived in the autumn of 1914. At the age of 22, she brought with her a refined education obtained in St. Louis and a determination to make a difference in the lives of local children. Hired by the school board to teach at Cedar Hollow Elementary School, Abigail quickly stood out not only for her pedagogical competence, but also for her striking beauty and captivating personality. Descended from a well-established merchant family in St. Louis, Abigail had deliberately chosen to leave the comforts of city life to venture into the countryside. Her letters to her family, later discovered in the county archives, revealed an idealistic young woman determined to bring education and progress to forgotten communities. She deeply believed that education was the key to breaking the cycles of poverty and isolation that characterized many rural Missouri communities. Abigail's arrival had an immediate impact on Cedar Hollow. Her polite manner of speaking, her well-tailored dresses, and her innovative teaching methods contrasted sharply with the local way of life. While some families welcomed her with enthusiasm, seeing in her an opportunity for progress for their children, others watched this young stranger with suspicion, who brought with her an air of urban superiority. During her first few months in town, Abigail stayed at the Morrison family residence, owners of the general store. Sarah Morrison, a middle-aged widow, became her closest confidant, and it was through her personal notes that much of what we know about Abigail's early days in Cedar Hollow has been preserved. Sarah described the young teacher as dedicated, intelligent, and surprisingly brave for someone of her age and background. The winter of 1914 was particularly harsh in the Ozark Mountains. Snow blanketed the valleys for weeks on end, completely isolating communities like Cedar Hollow from the rest of the world. The roads became impassable, the mail stopped arriving, and the town turned inward in a way that hadn't happened in years. It was during this period of isolation that the first strange signs began to appear. Small details that at the time seemed insignificant, but which would later prove to be fundamental pieces of a macabre puzzle. During that claustrophobic winter of 1915, Cedar Hollow turned into an island lost in time. The accumulated snow reached the windows of the single-story houses, and the biting Ozark wind howled among the bare trees like the laments of lost souls. It was against this bleak backdrop that the inhabitants began to notice subtle changes in Abigail Renshaw's behavior. Sarah Morrison recorded in her personal diary that the young teacher had become more introspective after the new year. Lively conversations about teaching methods and plans to improve local education gave way to long periods of contemplative silence. Abigail spent hours gazing out her bedroom window at the white landscape stretching as far as the eye could see, as if searching for something only she could perceive. The older residents of Cedar Hollow had their own theories about what was affecting the young outsider. Some whispered that the isolation of the mountains had a peculiar effect on people unaccustomed to rural solitude. Others, more superstitious, spoke of restless spirits inhabiting the ancient forests. Legends passed down from generation to generation told of mysterious disappearances that occurred deep in the Ozark Mountains. Dr. Edmund Hayes, the only physician in the area, was informally consulted about Abigail's condition. His notes, discovered decades later in the county's medical files, reveal his concern about what he described as a deep melancholy that seemed to be consuming the young teacher. Hayes mentioned symptoms that we would recognize today as seasonal depression, but at the time, such conditions were poorly understood and often attributed to moral weaknesses or supernatural influences. It was during a particularly violent storm in mid-February that the first truly disruptive event occurred. Thomas Caldwell, a local farmer who lived approximately 2 miles from town, reported seeing a female figure walking barefoot through the snow in the early morning hours. According to his testimony, later given to the county sheriff, the woman wore only a white shirt and was walking towards the dense forests surrounding Cedar Hollow. When Caldwell woke Sarah Morrison the next morning to report the strange sighting, they discovered that Abigail had spent the entire night in her room, apparently sound asleep. Her nightclothes were dry and clean, her feet showed no signs of exposure to the cold, and she herself showed no awareness of a possible nighttime excursion. The incident was filed as a possible delusion of Caldwell's, who had drunk a considerable amount of corn whiskey that night. But the strange events did not stop there. Over the following weeks, other residents began reporting similar sightings. Widow Martha Henderson swore she saw a long-haired woman dancing alone in the town cemetery during a moonless night. Young Peter Whitmore, the son of the local blacksmith, claimed to have found female footprints in the snow that led from the Morrison home to the edge of the forest, where they simply vanished without a trace. What made these reports even more disturbing was the consistency of the details. All the witnesses described the same ethereal figure, a young woman with loose dark hair wearing white clothes that floated in the wind, as if defying the laws of physics. Even more intriguing was the fact that, on all the reported occasions, Abigail was visibly present in her bed when checked, sleeping with the tranquility of a child. Sarah Morrison began documenting these episodes with growing concern. Her notes reveal a woman torn between loyalty to her young guest and genuine fear of what might be happening under her own roof. She describes how Abigail seemed strangely refreshed on the mornings following the alleged sightings, as if she had absorbed some mysterious energy during the nights. Reverend Joshua Miller, pastor of the local Methodist church, was approached by several families concerned about the unexplained events. A man of solid faith, but also a pragmatist, Miller initially tried to rationalize the sightings as products of anxious minds trapped by the harsh winter. However, when he himself reported seeing the mysterious figure during one of his nightly prayer vigils, the atmosphere in Cedar Hollow changed for good. The town that had once embraced Abigail as an educational blessing now whispered about her presence with a mixture of morbid fascination and superstitious terror. The isolation of winter, which should have created closer bonds among the inhabitants, was instead generating a collective paranoia that would transform this small, quiet community into the epicenter of one of the most disconcerting mysteries in Missouri history. The arrival of late March brought with it the melting of the Ozark snow, but also revelations that would leave the people of Cedar Hollow even more disturbed. As the snow melted, exposing frozen soil that had remained hidden for months, residents began to make discoveries that would challenge their understanding of reality. Joshua Brennan, one of the most experienced lumberjacks in the area, was the first to find the strange marks. During one of his morning forays into the forest surrounding the town, he came across a circular clearing where the vegetation had been arranged in a geometrically perfect manner. Dry branches formed intricate patterns. Stones were stacked into precise towers, and in the center of it all, the earth had been dug into a perfectly round hole approximately 3 feet in diameter. What made the discovery even more perplexing was the impossibility of determining when that configuration had been created. Snow had completely covered the area all winter, and there were no visible footprints leading to the clearing. Furthermore, the branches used in the construction of the patterns were visibly weathered, suggesting they had been laid out long before the first snowfall. Brennan immediately reported his discovery to Deputy Sheriff William Crawford, the only law enforcement representative available in Cedar Hollow during the winter months. Crawford, a practical man who had served briefly in the Civil War and seen his share of unexplained events, decided to investigate the site personally. What he found left him deeply disturbed. In addition to the patterns of branches and stones, Crawford discovered fragments of white cloth trapped in the bushes around the clearing. The material was of superior quality, similar to that used in the nightgowns of wealthy women. Even more disturbing were the barefoot female footprints leading from the clearing in various directions, some heading back towards town, others disappearing deep into the forest. During his investigation, Crawford also found a small leather-bound diary, partially buried near the center of the clearing. The pages were damaged by moisture, but still mostly legible. What was written on those stained pages would forever change the perception of the events that had plagued Cedar Hollow during the winter. The diary contained entries dated from different periods, some dating back to the previous autumn, others more recent. The handwriting was clearly feminine and neat, but the content was deeply disturbing. Early entries described vivid dreams about ancestral callings and voices from the ancient mountains. Progressively, the notes became more incoherent, mixing references to pagan rituals with detailed observations about the residents of Cedar Hollow. One particularly shocking entry dated January 23rd described in detail the exact location of personal belongings of several town residents, information that would be impossible to know without intimate access to their homes. Another passage, apparently written during one of February's storms, recounted private conversations between couples in town that had taken place behind closed doors. Crawford took the diary directly to Sarah Morrison, hoping she could identify the authorship through handwriting. Sarah's reaction was immediate and visceral. With trembling hands, she confirmed that the writing was unmistakably Abigail Renshaw's. But when confronted with this evidence, Abigail herself showed complete surprise and vehemently denied any knowledge of the diary or the activities described within it. The situation became even more complex when the local doctor, Dr. Hayes, examined Abigail for signs of cold exposure or injuries that might corroborate the nighttime activities described in the diary. To his surprise, he found disturbing physical evidence. The soles of Abigail's feet showed calluses and cuts, consistent with long, barefoot walks on rough ground, despite her insistence that she had not left the house all winter. Even more intriguing were the small scars on her palms, fresh wounds that looked like they were caused by thorns or sharp branches. When Hayes asked about these marks, Abigail looked at her own hands with genuine confusion, as if she was seeing them for the first time. The discovery of the diary and the physical evidence created an atmosphere of terror that permeated every aspect of life in Cedar Hollow. Families began locking their doors for the first time in decades. Children were kept indoors after dark, and whispered conversations dominated gatherings at the church and general store. Reverend Miller organized a community meeting at the church to discuss the situation and seek a peaceful solution. But as the details of the case spread, it became clear that Cedar Hollow was facing something far beyond the comprehension of a simple rural community. The events that would unfold in the coming days would test not only the residents' faith, but also their ability to distinguish between reality and nightmare. The meeting at Cedar Hollow Methodist Church took place on a particularly cold April night, with winds that made the glass windows shake like leaves in the wind. Almost the entire population of the town crammed onto the wooden benches, faces illuminated by the flickering light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. Reverend Miller opened the meeting with a prayer, but his words were punctuated by the anxious murmurs of the congregation. The atmosphere was charged with tension, fear, and a morbid curiosity that turned neighbors into suspicious strangers. Sarah Morrison had insisted that Abigail attend, believing that only through full transparency could the situation be resolved. Abigail sat on the first bench, her hands clasped in her lap, her face pale but determined. She wore a simple conservative navy blue dress, her hair tied in a tight bun that accentuated the severity of her features. To many present, she seemed more like a defendant on trial than the respected teacher who had arrived just a few months earlier. Deputy Sheriff Crawford was the first to speak, methodically reporting the discoveries in the woods, the diary evidence, and the results of the medical examination. His voice echoed in the silent church, each word falling like a stone in still water. As he described the most disturbing details, some of those present made the sign of the cross, others whispered low prayers, and some simply stared at Abigail with a mixture of fascination and horror. When Crawford finished his account, a heavy silence fell over the church. It was broken by the trembling voice of Martha Henderson, the widow who had reported spotting the female figure in the cemetery. With tears streaming down her wrinkled face, she slowly stood up and pointed an accusing finger in Abigail's direction. Martha revealed that during one of the nights, she had supposedly seen the apparition. She had followed the mysterious figure to the cemetery. Hidden behind a headstone, she watched as the woman knelt before the grave of Henry Walsh, a merchant who had died 20 years earlier under mysterious circumstances. According to Martha, the figure began digging the earth with her bare hands, muttering words in a language she had never heard before. Martha's testimony provoked an explosion of agitated comments. Several people began speaking at once, some defending Abigail, others demanding her immediate expulsion from the town. The noise became deafening until Reverend Miller slammed the gavel on the pulpit, demanding order. It was then that Abigail stood up to speak for the first time since the meeting began. Her voice, normally clear and confident, came out as a broken whisper that forced everyone to lean forward to hear her. She solemnly swore that she had no memory of any of the activities described, that she woke up every morning in her own bed without any recollection of having gone out during the night. But then Abigail made a revelation that left everyone paralyzed. She described recurring dreams that had plagued her since her arrival in Cedar Hollow, visions so vivid that they seemed more real than reality itself. In her dreams, she walked through the ancient forests, conversing with voices that emerged from the trees themselves. Voices that told her stories about the first inhabitants of the Ozark Mountains, about forgotten rituals and secrets buried for generations. She related how in her dreams she was led to specific places in the forest where she found objects buried decades ago, ancient coins, rudimentary tools, bones that looked human but were too small to belong to adults. In her dreams, voices explained to her that Cedar Hollow had been built on a sacred site, a meeting place for ancient energies that demanded recognition and respect. The local doctor, Dr. Hayes, stood up to offer a more rational explanation. He suggested that Abigail might be suffering from a condition known as complex sleepwalking, a form of sleep disorder that could explain the nocturnal activities without conscious memory. Hayes had read about similar cases in medical journals in Chicago and St. Louis, conditions where patients performed elaborate activities during states of altered consciousness. But his scientific explanation was quickly challenged by more superstitious voices in the congregation. Old Tom Patterson, patriarch of one of Cedar Hollow's founding families, stood up, leaning on his cane, and began talking about the area's forgotten history. According to him, the Ozark Mountains had been inhabited long before the arrival of European settlers, and some areas maintained a connection to forces that the civilized mind could not comprehend. Patterson revealed that his own grandfather, one of the first settlers to settle in the area, had found evidence of ancient rituals during the construction of the first houses: buried stone circles, primitive tools, and bones arranged in specific patterns that suggested complex, ceremonial practices. According to family tradition, some places in the mountains were considered portals between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. The meeting went on until well after midnight, with increasingly disturbing testimonies and increasingly elaborate theories. Some held that Abigail was an innocent victim of forces beyond her control. Others insisted that she posed an active danger to the community. When they finally dispersed, the residents of Cedar Hollow carried with them more questions than answers, and the feeling that they were dealing with something far beyond their comprehension or ability to resolve. The days following the church meeting turned Cedar Hollow into a divided city. Families that had been neighbors for generations now greeted each other suspiciously. Children were forbidden to play near the Morrison home, and a heavy silence hung over the dirt streets that once echoed with friendly conversation and innocent laughter. Sarah Morrison faced a terrible dilemma. On the one hand, her Christian conscience prevented her from abandoning a young woman in need. On the other, genuine fear of the strange occurrences in her own home was beginning to consume her peace of mind. Her notes from this period reveal a tormented woman torn between compassion and self-preservation. It was during this tense atmosphere that the first disappearance occurred. Lucy Hartwell, a 12-year-old girl known for her insatiable curiosity and penchant for exploring forbidden places, simply disappeared during a seemingly normal April afternoon. Her mother, Eleanor Hartwell, had sent her daughter to the grocery store to buy sugar for dinner. The distance was only 3 blocks, a route Lucy had taken hundreds of times before. When Lucy did not return after 2 hours, Eleanor went out to look for her. Sarah Morrison confirmed that the girl had never arrived at the store. An immediate search was organized, involving virtually all adult males in the city. They searched every house, every barn, every hidden corner of Cedar Hollow, but found no sign of the missing girl. Deputy Sheriff Crawford expanded the search to the surrounding forests, forming teams that traveled along known trails and previously unexplored areas. For 3 consecutive days, the cries calling for Lucy echoed through the Ozark Mountains, but the only answers were the echoes of their own voices reverberating through the tree-covered hills. It was Joshua Brennan, the same woodcutter who had discovered the mysterious clearing, who found the first real clue to Lucy's whereabouts. Approximately 2 miles northeast of town, in an area of the woods known locally as Hollow Creek, he discovered a child's shoe stuck in the low branches of an ancient oak tree. The shoe was unmistakably Lucy Hartwell's, a small brown leather shoe that her mother had personally sewn the previous winter. The discovery led the search team directly to an area of the forest that few locals dared to explore. Hollow Creek was known for its treacherous geography, with deep ravines hidden by dense vegetation, and streams that changed course depending on the season. Even more disturbing were the local legends about people who had entered the area and were never seen again. As the search team went deeper into Hollow Creek, they began to find disturbing evidence, small footprints, clearly those of a child, led along an almost invisible trail that wound between centuries-old trees. The footprints were accompanied by larger markings, barefoot footprints of an adult that seemed to guide or follow the smaller footprints. The trail led the team to an even more remote part of the forest, where they discovered something that would make any parent's blood freeze in their veins. In a small circular clearing, similar to the one previously discovered, they found Lucy's clothes neatly folded and stacked on a flat stone. Her clothes were clean and dry, as if they had been removed and folded with ceremonious care. But Lucy herself was still missing. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of violence, just her clothes abandoned in a place that seemed to have been prepared specifically for this purpose. Crawford thoroughly scanned the area, looking for any clues that might indicate what had happened to the girl, but the forest guarded its secrets with unearthly tenacity. It was during this desperate search that one of the team members made a discovery that would definitively connect the strange events to Abigail Renshaw. Among the trees surrounding the clearing where Lucy's clothes were found, Edwin Parker, the local blacksmith, discovered fragments of navy blue fabric stuck in the thorns of a bush. Parker immediately recognized the material as identical to the dress Abigail had worn during the church meeting a few days earlier. The fabric was of superior quality, clearly different from the rustic materials used by local women. When Crawford examined the fragments, he found strands of dark hair attached along with the fabric, hair that perfectly matched the color and texture of Abigail's hair. The discovery of these fragments created a wave of panic that spread through Cedar Hollow like fire through dry grass. For the first time since the strange events began, there was direct physical evidence connecting Abigail to the disappearance of a child. The atmosphere of suspicion that had hung over the young teacher turned into direct accusations and demands for immediate action. Eleanor Hartwell, consumed by the grief and despair of a mother who had lost her daughter, led a group of women to the Morrison home, demanding that Abigail be handed over to the authorities. Their furious voices echoed down the main street as they shouted accusations of witchcraft, kidnapping, and occult practices. The situation was rapidly deteriorating into something that could result in actual violence, and Crawford knew he needed to act quickly to maintain order and protect everyone involved. The tension in Cedar Hollow had reached a dangerous boiling point. Crawford knew he had to make a difficult decision before the angry mob took justice into their own hands. Reluctantly, but recognizing the need to protect both Abigail and the community, he decided to place her in protective custody until the lead sheriff could arrive from Springfield to conduct an official investigation. The small Cedar Hollow jail consisted of just 2 cells built in the basement of City Hall, rarely used for anything more serious than riotous drunkards or minor disputes between neighbors. When Crawford escorted Abigail to her temporary cell, she offered no resistance, but her expression revealed a deep confusion mixed with a growing terror about her own mental condition. Sarah Morrison insisted on staying close, bringing Abigail meals and clean clothes. During these visits, she documented conversations that revealed the young teacher's deteriorating psychological state. Abigail began to recount fragments of memories that emerged like pieces of a haunted puzzle, distorted images of nighttime walks that she couldn't distinguish between dreams and reality. During her second night in jail, Abigail had what Sarah described as a night terror episode. She began screaming in her sleep, calling out to Lucy Hartwell by name, and begging them to stop whispering in her mind. When Crawford woke her up, Abigail was in a state of total panic, insisting that she could hear voices of children calling for help from deep in the woods. Even more disturbing was what Abigail revealed during these moments of fragmented lucidity. She described visions of an underground place, a natural cave decorated with ancient symbols, where children were kept in a state between wakefulness and sleep. According to her delusional descriptions, the children were not dead, but neither were they truly alive, existing in an ethereal limbo while serving purposes that her conscious mind refused to comprehend. Dr. Hayes was called in to examine Abigail and determine if she was mentally competent to face the mounting charges against her. His examination revealed symptoms he had never encountered in his rural medical practice. Abigail had periods of complete lucidity, alternating with dissociative states, where she seemed to be responding to stimuli that only she could perceive. During one of these examinations, Hayes made a discovery that would leave him tormented for the rest of his life. As he examined Abigail's palms, he noticed that the cuts and scars he had previously observed had healed abnormally quickly, leaving only barely noticeable marks. Stranger still, new marks had appeared during her stay in jail, fresh wounds that she insisted she did not remember having acquired. It was during Abigail's third night in jail that the second disappearance occurred. Timothy Walsh, a 10-year-old boy and grandson of the merchant who had mysteriously died 20 years earlier, disappeared from his own bed in the early hours of the morning. His mother, Rebecca Walsh, discovered the disappearance when she went to wake him up for morning chores and found only cold sheets and an open window that she was sure she had locked the night before. The discovery of the second disappearance created absolute panic in Cedar Hollow. Families barricaded their doors, children were kept under constant surveillance, and some residents began to talk seriously about abandoning the city altogether. The coincidence of Timothy being from the Walsh family, whose patriarch had been mentioned in Martha Henderson's testimony about the cemetery, added an ominous layer of historical connection to the events. Crawford immediately organized a new search, this time attended by armed men from surrounding communities who had heard about the strange happenings in Cedar Hollow. The search focused on the Hollow Creek area, where Lucy's clothes had been found, but it also expanded to known caves and rock formations that could serve as hiding places. During this intensive search, the team made discoveries that would confirm the community's worst fears. In a natural cave located approximately 3 miles north of the city, they found clear evidence of recent human occupation. Barefoot footprints led into the depths of the cave, accompanied by signs that children had been there recently. The cave extended much deeper into the mountain than anyone had imagined. As the search team ventured into the narrow passages, lit only by torches and oil lanterns, they discovered natural chambers decorated with primitive symbols, etched into the stone. The symbols looked ancient, long before the European colonization of the region, but some were clearly fresh, recently engraved by human hands. In the deepest chamber they could reach, the team made a discovery that would leave them scarred forever. They found clear evidence that children had been held there recently. Small footprints in the damp clay of the cave floor, fragments of children's clothing, and most disturbing of all, toys and personal effects that were identified as belonging to both Lucy and Timothy. But the children themselves remained missing, as if they had simply dissolved into the air from deep within the mountain. The cave held secrets that seemed to defy not only comprehension, but the very sanity of those who dared to investigate it. And, as the search continued in the dark depths of the earth in Cedar Hollow, Abigail Renshaw remained in her cell, muttering words in languages no one could identify, her eyes fixed on something only she could see, in the shadows dancing on the stone walls. The arrival of Chief Sheriff Charles Morrison from Springfield brought an outside authority that Cedar Hollow desperately needed, but it also revealed the true extent of the complexity of the case. Morrison was a seasoned man, a veteran of criminal investigations in rural Missouri, but even he later admitted that nothing in his career had prepared him for the events he encountered in that small town in the Ozarks. Morrison spent 2 full days interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, and trying to construct a coherent narrative of events. His official notes filed in Webster County records reveal a meticulous investigator struggling to apply criminal logic to phenomena that seem to defy rational explanation. During his interview with Abigail, Morrison observed behaviors that deeply disturbed him. The young teacher demonstrated periods of complete mental clarity, answering questions in an articulate and intelligent way, followed by episodes where she seemed to be talking to invisible presences. Even more disconcerting was her ability to describe specific details about the cave that the search team had discovered. Despite the fact that she had been in custody when the discovery was made, Morrison decided to conduct an experiment that, while unscientific by modern standards, could provide insights into Abigail's condition. With Dr. Hayes's reluctant permission, he arranged a night vigil where Abigail would be watched continuously by multiple witnesses throughout the night. The goal was to definitively determine if she was capable of physical activities during states of altered consciousness. The vigil was conducted at the Methodist Church with Reverend Miller, Sarah Morrison, Dr. Hayes, and Sheriff Morrison himself serving as observers. Abigail was placed on a cot in the center of the nave, surrounded by chairs where observers would take turns keeping constant watch. Lanterns were strategically placed to eliminate any shadows where undetected activity could occur. During the early hours of the night, Abigail appeared to sleep normally, breathing regularly and remaining motionless on her cot. But at about 2 in the morning, something extraordinary began to happen. Even though she remained physically still, Abigail began to murmur in a language that none of the observers could identify. Reverend Miller, who had studied Latin and some biblical languages during his theological training, initially thought it might be an archaic form of European language. But as he continued to listen, he realized that the sound patterns were completely different from anything he had encountered in his studies. The words seemed to flow in rhythms and cadences that suggested a structured and complex language, not just incoherent delusions. During these moments of mysterious speech, observers noticed subtle but unsettling physical changes in Abigail. Her breathing became deeper and more regular, almost hypnotic in its rhythm. Her hands, which had remained relaxed at her sides, began to move in precise, repetitive gestures, as if she were directing invisible activities or participating in complex rituals. Even more disturbing was what Sarah Morrison described as a change in the very atmosphere of the church. The temperature appeared to drop significantly, causing the flames of the lanterns to flicker despite the absence of drafts. A strange odor began to permeate the room, something that Dr. Hayes later described as a mixture of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something indefinable that resembled ancient incense. It was during the peak of these strange phenomena that something happened that would leave observers questioning their own sanity. Despite Abigail remaining physically present and motionless on her cot, all 4 observers simultaneously reported seeing a translucent figure separate from her lying body. The figure, which retained Abigail's appearance but seemed made of silver mist, moved silently through the church before disappearing through the wooden walls. Morrison, a practical man accustomed to dealing with hard facts, initially tried to rationalize the experience as a collective hallucination caused by fatigue and tension. But when he independently consulted each observer about what they had seen, the descriptions were consistent in specific details that would have been impossible to coordinate in advance. The phenomenon lasted approximately 45 minutes, after which Abigail gradually returned to normal sleep, ceasing the murmurs and mysterious gestures. When she awoke the next morning, she showed no memory of the night's events, but she seemed noticeably paler and more exhausted, as if she had participated in strenuous physical activities. The vigil raised more questions than it provided answers, but it set a disturbing precedent. If Abigail was somehow capable of astral projection or out-of-body experiences, then her alleged lack of memory about nighttime activities could be genuine, while she could still be physically responsible for the mysterious events that plagued Cedar Hollow. Morrison realized he was dealing with something that transcended his traditional methods of inquiry. He decided to expand his research to include historical records of the region, hoping to find precedents or patterns that could explain the current phenomena. What he discovered in the Dusty County files would completely change his understanding of the case and reveal a dark history that connected current events to forgotten tragedies of the distant past. Webster County's historical archives held secrets that had lain buried for decades. Yellowed documents that Morrison discovered piled up in dusty boxes in the basement of the county courthouse. Among minutes of town hall meetings and property records, he found reports that would reveal an ominous pattern connecting current events to similar tragedies that had haunted the region for generations. The first disturbing document was a sheriff's report from 1893 describing the mysterious disappearance of 3 children from the nearby community of Willow Creek, located just 15 miles from Cedar Hollow. According to the report, the children had disappeared over a period of 3 weeks, always during new moon nights, always leaving no trace other than neatly folded clothing found in forest clearings. Even more shocking was the description of a young woman who had arrived in Willow Creek a few weeks before the first disappearances. The report described her as a polite teacher from the big city, behaving strangely at night and being seen walking through the woods in altered states of consciousness. The similarity to Abigail's current situation was impossible to ignore. Morrison continued digging through the archives and discovered a pattern that stretched even further into the past. Similar reports dated back to 1871 in a community called Pine Ridge, to 1849 in Bear Creek, and so on, going back decades in the history of the region. In each case, an educated young woman would arrive in a small rural community, followed by mysterious disappearances of children and unexplained phenomena. What made these documents even more disturbing was the consistency of the physical descriptions of the women involved. All were described as young people of approximately 20 years old, with dark hair and penetrating eyes, educated and refined, but manifesting inexplicable nocturnal behaviors. The similarities were not only general, but too specific to be coincidences. In a particularly detailed document from 1876, Morrison found the account of a local physician who had tried to scientifically study the phenomena. The doctor described experiments similar to the vigil that Morrison had organized, with practically identical results. The woman involved demonstrated abilities that defied medical explanation at the time, including knowledge of distant events and abilities that suggested some kind of expanded consciousness. Even more unsettling was the discovery that in all documented historical cases, the women eventually disappeared as mysteriously as they had arrived, leaving behind only unanswered questions and traumatized communities. In some accounts, witnesses claimed to have seen the women simply dissolve into the morning mist, while others reported that they walked into the woods and were never seen again. Morrison also discovered ancient maps that revealed fascinating geological information about the region. The Ozarks contained an extensive network of natural caves and rock formations that connected through complex underground systems. Most significantly, many of these caves contained evidence of human habitation that predated European colonization by centuries, suggesting that the area had been considered sacred by Native American populations. An informal archaeological report from 1882 described the discovery of ceremonial chambers deep in the caves, decorated with symbols that did not correspond to any known native culture of the region. The report mentioned strange artifacts, including clay masks with disturbingly human expressions and ceremonial tools whose purpose was impossible to determine. Armed with this historical information, Morrison returned to Cedar Hollow with a completely new perspective on the case. If historical patterns were correct, Abigail might not be a criminal in the traditional sense, but rather part of a phenomenon that transcended conventional explanations. The issue was no longer just about her individual culpability, but about much larger forces that seemed to use young women as instruments for incomprehensible purposes. Morrison decided to confront Abigail with the historical evidence, hoping that knowledge of past patterns might trigger memories or insights into her own condition. When he showed her the old documents, Abigail's reaction was dramatic and immediate. She began to tremble violently. Her eyes widened in terror, and she began to murmur fragmented phrases about eternal cycles and ancient guardians. During this episode, Abigail revealed fragments of information that she could not have known through conventional means. She described specific cave locations that did not appear on any official map, mentioned names of people from historical accounts that Morrison had not shared with her, and demonstrated detailed knowledge about rituals and practices that only a dedicated scholar of the region's occult history could possess. Even more disturbing was when Abigail began to speak in the first person about events that had occurred decades before her birth, as if she had been present during the historical incidents. She described in vivid detail the arrival in past communities, the first contacts with the ancient forces of the caves, and the inevitable tragic conclusion that always followed the same pattern. The conversation revealed that Abigail, or the entity that inhabited her, was aware of the historical cycles and her role within them. But it also revealed her genuine horror at the situation, her desperate struggle against forces she couldn't fully control or comprehend, and her growing fear about the fate of the missing children who had been dragged into this supernatural drama. Abigail's revelations about historical cycles created a moral and practical dilemma that Morrison had never faced in his career. As sheriff, he had a duty to protect the community and seek justice for the missing children. But as a rational man facing phenomena that defied all logic, he found himself sailing in completely unknown waters. Morrison decided to organize a final expedition to the caves, this time taking Abigail with him in the hopes that her presence could reveal the location of the missing children. The decision was controversial, with many Cedar Hollow residents arguing that bringing the alleged perpetrator back to the scene of the crimes would be dangerous and potentially disastrous. The expedition was carefully planned, with Morrison selecting only experienced and reliable men to accompany him. Joshua Brennan would serve as the lead guide, knowing the forests better than any other resident. Dr. Hayes would accompany them to monitor Abigail's mental condition and provide medical assistance if necessary. Edwin Parker, the blacksmith, was included for his physical strength and practical skills that might be needed in the depths of the caves. As the expedition prepared to depart on the morning of a gray May day, a dense fog blanketed the Ozark Mountains, creating an ominous atmosphere that seemed to foreshadow significant events. Abigail, escorted in handcuffs but treated with cautious respect, displayed an eerie calm that contrasted with the visible anxiety of the other members of the group. As they approached the known caves, Abigail began to demonstrate behaviors that surprised the expedition. Instead of following the trails leading to the entrances of the caves already explored, she pointed in a completely different direction, guiding the group through dense vegetation to a part of the mountain that none of them had previously visited. The area where Abigail led them seemed strangely quiet, as if the wildlife itself avoided that spot. There was no bird song, insect buzzing, or any of the natural sounds that normally permeated the forests of the Ozark Mountains. The only thing that broke the silence was the sound of their own footsteps on damp leaves and broken branches. Abigail stopped in front of a rock formation that at first glance seemed to be just a natural outcrop of the mountain. But when Brennan took a closer look, he discovered that what appeared to be solid stone was actually a carefully camouflaged entrance, hidden by centuries of plant growth and natural erosion. The entrance was too narrow to allow adults to pass through without considerable effort. As the expedition prepared to enter the hidden cave, Abigail began to murmur in a low voice, but this time her words were in clear English, she described what they would find inside, talking about chambers connected by narrow passages, about paintings on the walls that told stories of ancient rituals, and about a central chamber where the children would be waiting. Abigail's description of the children waiting intrigued and terrified the members of the expedition. She did not say that they were dead or injured, but rather that they were in a state of suspension, waiting for a specific moment when they could return to the world of the living. Her words suggested that the children were not victims in the traditional sense, but unwitting participants in a much larger cosmic drama. Entry into the cave immediately revealed that this was a very different site from the caves previously explored. The walls were covered in engraved symbols that seemed to pulse in the dim light of their lanterns, creating the illusion of movement and life. The symbols did not follow recognizable patterns from any known culture, but their complexity and accuracy suggested a sophisticated ancient civilization. As they went deeper into the cave, following Abigail, who seemed to know every turn and passage, they began to hear sounds they couldn't identify. They were like distant whispers, almost at the edge of auditory perception, voices that seemed to be conversing in unknown tongues. The sounds came from different directions, creating the impression that the cave was inhabited by unseen presences. The first significant chamber they found contained clear evidence of recent ceremonial use. The floor was covered in concentric circles made of small stones, each circle containing different symbols etched into the wet clay. In the center of the circles, they found personal objects of the missing children arranged in specific patterns, as if they were offerings or elements of complex rituals. But the children themselves were still absent, and Abigail indicated that they needed to go deeper, to chambers that she described as the heart of the mountain. As they continued their journey deep into the earth, the temperature began to drop noticeably, and the air quality changed, becoming denser and charged with an indefinable odor reminiscent of a mixture of ancient earth and exotic incense. It was then that they began to hear something that would chill the blood of any parent: the clear, recognizable voices of children singing in harmony. The voices of Lucy Hartwell and Timothy Walsh echoed through the passages of the cave. But their song was not in English, and the melody was at once beautiful and deeply disturbing, as if it had been composed in time immemorial, for purposes which the modern mind could not comprehend. The sound of children's voices echoing through the depths of the cave created a hypnotic effect that seemed to affect each member of the expedition differently. Morrison felt an almost irresistible compulsion to follow the voices, as if they were calling specifically for him. Brennan, on the other hand, showed signs of increasing panic, his hand shaking as he held the flashlight with excessive force. Abigail, who had been relatively calm throughout the descent, began to show signs of extreme agitation as they approached the source of the voices. She mumbled constantly now, alternating between pleas in English for them to let the children go, and phrases in unknown languages that sounded like answers to conversations only she could hear. The final passage leading to the central chamber was extraordinarily narrow, forcing the men to move in single file, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on the symbol-covered walls. As they emerged into the final chamber, what they found challenged not only their expectations, but their own understanding of reality. The chamber was vastly larger than any natural formation would have allowed. Its roof was lost in darkness beyond the reach of their lights. The walls were covered in intricate paintings that seemed to tell an epic story. Images of human figures interacting with entities that were neither clearly human nor animal, but something in between. The paintings seemed to move in the flickering light, creating the illusion of a developing narrative. In the center of the chamber, in a circular area defined by natural stone columns, they found Lucy Hartwell and Timothy Walsh. The children were sitting in meditative positions, their eyes closed, breathing slowly and regularly. They wore simple clothes made of a material that none of the men could identify, something that looked like fabric but glowed with a subtle luminescence of its own. Morrison ran to the children, checking their pulses and trying to wake them up. Both were alive. Their vital signs were normal, but they seemed to be in a state of deep trance. When he tried to lift Lucy, she opened her eyes briefly, revealing pupils that reflected light like those of a nocturnal animal. She looked directly at him and whispered in a voice that no longer sounded her own. "It's not time yet, Sheriff Morrison. The cycle must be completed." Dr. Hayes examined Timothy and found that the boy was in a similar state, physically healthy but mentally absent, as if his consciousness was somewhere far away from his body. When Hayes tried various techniques to awaken the boy, he responded only with blank stares and serene smiles that were more disturbing than any expression of fear. It was then that Abigail began to speak, but her voice had changed completely. It was no longer the polite voice of the young teacher from St. Louis, but something much older and deeper, as if multiple voices were speaking through her simultaneously. She explained that the children had been chosen to serve as bridges between the world of the living and a realm that existed beyond normal human perception. According to the entity speaking through Abigail, the Ozarks were one of the few places on Earth where the veil between dimensions was thin enough to allow communication with beings inhabiting parallel realities. Children, with their minds not yet fully formed by the prejudices of adulthood, were ideal recipients for these interdimensional communications. The entity revealed that the historical cycles of disappearances were not predatory in the human sense, but part of an ancient agreement between primitive human civilizations and the guardians of these dimensional portals in exchange for knowledge and protection. Human communities occasionally provided young people who would serve as intermediaries, facilitating communication between worlds. Abigail, or the force that inhabited her, explained that she herself had been chosen in a previous life to serve this purpose. But something had gone wrong in the process. Instead of completing her transformation, she had become trapped in a state between worlds, forced to return cyclically to try to complete her original mission. Each appearance in different communities over the decades was a new attempt to fulfill its cosmic function. The missing children were neither dead nor injured, but were being prepared to become permanent guardians of the portal. They would serve as sentinels, protecting access between dimensions and facilitating future communications when needed. It was a fate that transcended normal human death, offering a form of immortality, but at the cost of their earthly humanity. Morrison, struggling to process these impossible revelations, asked if there was any way to reverse the process and return the children to their families. The answer he received was complex and disturbing. The children could theoretically return, but only if another soul agreed to take their place voluntarily, completing the cosmic balance that the guardians demanded. The entity looked directly at Morrison through Abigail's eyes and made a proposal that would test not only his courage, but his own understanding of sacrifice and duty. It offered to release the children and break Abigail's cycle permanently, but only if someone present agreed to take her place as the portal's willing guardian. The silence that followed this proposal was so deep that the men could hear their own heartbeats echoing in the ancient chamber. Each member of the expedition faced a choice that would define not only the fate of the missing children, but potentially the future of generations of families in Cedar Hollow and surrounding communities. The entity's proposal echoed through the ancient chamber as an ultimatum that would forever divide the line between the known and the unexplained world. Morrison looked into the faces of his companions, seeing the reflection of his own terror and fascination in the eyes of men who had faced earthly dangers, but never something that challenged their own understanding of existence. Joshua Brennan was the first to break the silence, his raspy voice laden with decades of rural superstitions that finally found terrifying validation. He whispered that he had always known that the Ozarks held secrets older than human memory, but he never imagined that one day he would be faced with the choice of preserving or challenging forces that governed realities beyond his comprehension. Dr. Hayes, a man of science battling evidence that destroyed his fundamental beliefs about medicine and rationality, re-examined the children in a trance. His medical knowledge told him that Lucy and Timothy were physically healthy, but his experience as a country healer whispered to him that they had crossed a boundary from which there might be no return through conventional methods. Edwin Parker, the pragmatic blacksmith who had spent his life working with iron and fire, found himself facing metals he couldn't shape and flames he couldn't control. His calloused hands, accustomed to creating useful tools from raw materials, trembled at forces that required a different kind of creation, a transformation that transcended physical craftsmanship. The entity speaking through Abigail began to reveal additional details about the nature of the proposed sacrifice. The willing guardian would not die in the traditional sense, but their consciousness would be expanded to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. They would become a living bridge between worlds, maintaining cosmic balance and protecting both sides of the dimensional boundary from destructive influences. Morrison asked about the practical implications of this transformation for the volunteers' family and community. The response was both reassuring and disturbing. The new guardian would remain physically present in Cedar Hollow, living a seemingly normal life, but would carry responsibilities that would extend far beyond ordinary human existence. They would age much more slowly, live much longer, but always carry the weight of knowledge about realities that the normal human mind cannot process. It was then that Abigail, momentarily struggling with the entity that controlled her, regained her own voice long enough to make a devastating confession. With tears streaming down her face, she revealed that she had tried to resist the call during all her historical appearances. But with each incomplete cycle, more innocents were dragged into the cosmic drama. Her refusal to voluntarily accept her fate had created an imbalance that resulted in greater suffering for others. Abigail's confession revealed the cosmic cruelty of the situation. Her attempts to preserve her own humanity had inadvertently condemned generations of children to be used as temporary substitutes. The real horror was not the existence of the guardians or the dimensional portals, but the consequence of resisting the role that the ancient forces had assigned to her. Morrison realized he faced a decision that would define not only the immediate fate of the missing children, but potentially the future of the entire region. If no one volunteered, the cycle would continue indefinitely, with Abigail being forced to return cyclically, and more children being dragged to serve as unwitting intermediaries. The entity offered one last revelation that would completely change the nature of the choice. It explained that the portal in the Ozark Mountains was weakening due to changes in the modern world. Industrialization, urban sprawl, and diminishing human connection to natural forces were gradually sealing the dimensional passages. If a volunteer guardian were established now, it would possibly be the last one needed, permanently ending the historical cycles of disappearances. Morrison looked at Lucy and Timothy, innocent children caught up in a drama that transcended anything their young minds had to face. He thought of their families in Cedar Hollow, desperately waiting for news about their missing children. He considered Abigail, a woman trapped between worlds for decades, suffering from her inability to accept a fate she had not chosen. As he pondered the magnitude of the decision, Morrison began to understand that some sacrifices transcend personal choice and become moral responsibilities. The question was no longer whether anyone should volunteer, but who among them was best prepared to carry a burden that would protect future generations from repeating the historical traumas that had haunted the region? The ancient chamber stood by in silence as four men faced a choice that would test not only their individual courage, but their collective understanding of sacrifice, responsibility, and the true price of protecting those they loved. Time was running out, and the whispering voices on the walls of the cave were beginning to grow in volume, as if the cosmic forces themselves were losing patience with human hesitation. The final decision came from an unexpected source. Joshua Brennan, the woodcutter who had discovered the first mysterious clearing, stepped forward with a determination that surprised everyone. His voice, normally hesitant in groups, echoed through the ancient chamber with a clarity that seemed to come from convictions deeply rooted in his connection to the forests of the Ozark Mountains. Brennan explained that he had spent his entire life walking the region's forgotten trails, always feeling presences he couldn't explain, always knowing that the mountains held secrets that transcended ordinary human understanding. He revealed that for years he had dreamed of visions similar to those Abigail described, but he had interpreted these experiences as products of an overactive imagination shaped by the solitude of the forests. Morrison tried to dissuade him, arguing that a man with family and community responsibilities should not make such a decision impulsively, but Brennan responded with a wisdom that revealed decades of quiet contemplation about his relationship with the mountains. He explained that he had always felt more at home in the depths of the forest than in any human construction. He had always known that his destiny was connected to the ancient secrets that permeated every tree and stone in the region. The entity speaking through Abigail confirmed that Brennan would be a suitable guardian. His decades of intuitive connection with the natural forces of the region had subconsciously prepared him for the role. The woodcutter had been unconsciously walking toward this moment all his adult life. His solitary expeditions through the woods were actually pilgrimages to a destination that was only now becoming clear. When Brennan touched the center stone of the chamber, formally accepting his new role, changes began to take place immediately. The paintings on the walls of the cave began to glow with a light of their own. The whispers of the ancient voices turned into harmonious songs, and Lucy and Timothy opened their eyes simultaneously, their normal human consciousness gradually returning as cosmic balance was restored. Abigail collapsed, finally freed from the entity that had inhabited her for decades. When she regained consciousness, she was again just a young teacher from St. Louis. Her memories of supernatural events faded like morning mist. The weight of generations of cosmic responsibility had been shifted, allowing her to return to the normal human life that had been denied for so long. The journey back to Cedar Hollow was marked by subtle but significant changes. The children remembered their experience as a long, unpleasant dream, keeping only vague impressions of kind voices and beautiful places. Abigail looked years younger, as if decades of supernatural tension had been lifted from her shoulders. Brennan walked with newfound confidence, his eyes occasionally focusing on distances that others couldn't perceive. Cedar Hollow welcomed the return of the missing children, with celebrations that lasted for days, but also with a tacit understanding that extraordinary events had taken place deep in the mountains. Families embraced their returned children, asking questions whose full answers would never be shared, accepting miracles that transcended rational explanation. Morrison filed his official report describing the case as an episode of mass hysteria, followed by the discovery of the lost children in the local caves. Abigail was officially acquitted of any crime, and the supernatural events were relegated to the realm of local legend. But those who were present in the ancient chamber carried with them knowledge that would forever change their perception of the limits of reality. Abigail eventually returned to St. Louis, where she married and lived a quiet life, always maintaining a career in education, but never again venturing into isolated rural communities. Her memories of the events at Cedar Hollow remained fragmented, like pieces of a disturbing dream that she preferred not to examine too closely. Joshua Brennan continued to live in Cedar Hollow, but he changed profoundly. Neighbors noted that he seemed to know about coming storms days before they arrived, that wild animals followed him fearlessly, and that he was occasionally seen talking to unseen presences during his solitary walks through the forests. He never married, dedicating his expanded life to protecting the balance between worlds that only he could fully perceive. The Ozarks have kept their secrets, but the historical cycles of disappearances have ceased permanently. Cedar Hollow grew and prospered, eventually becoming a thriving town that attracted tourists interested in its natural beauty and picturesque history. Few visitors suspected that they were walking over one of the last active portals between dimensions in North America, or that a silent guardian continued to guard borders that the modern mind had forgotten how to explore. The case of Abigail Renshaw remains officially shelved as a minor mystery in Missouri history. But for those who know the full truth, it serves as a reminder that there are forces in the world that transcend human understanding, responsibilities that span generations, and sacrifices that protect realities that most people will never know exist. If this journey through the dark depths of American history has piqued your curiosity about the mysteries that still await discovery, leave your comment telling which aspect intrigued you the most. Subscribe to the channel for more investigations into disturbing cases that challenge our understanding of reality. And ring the bell so you don't miss any of our expeditions to the darkest corners of history. Until the next journey through the inexplicable.